Thank you, Nari. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining our meeting today. There's a lot going on, and I know you've got a lot of questions, so I want to get to them as quickly as possible. I'll just start with an overview of what I've been working on and thinking about. I think some of you have heard me say how much different this year in Congress feels from my first term. There's still a lot of crazy, and we'll talk about that a little bit, but there's also a lot more productive work going on. And this week, we are approaching, I hope, the finish line for one of the most important pieces of legislation that I could possibly hope to work on, and that's a jobs and infrastructure bill that's going to do a lot of good for our communities and for New Jersey. As you know, we've already this year passed an incredibly useful and important piece of legislation, the American Rescue Plan, which is helping every single municipality in New Jersey provide services to my constituents, their constituents, without, hopefully, knock on wood, raising property taxes, making up for the revenue losses that many of our municipal and county governments suffered during COVID. So that's helping us by avoiding things that we would much rather avoid. We have taken a huge step to lowering the cost of healthcare for everybody in America who was relying on the Affordable Care Act individual marketplace, which was never affordable despite the name of the bill. Folks are saving hundreds of dollars a month right now on the exchanges if they've signed up to renew their coverage. A new child tax credit that is helping families who need childcare, who need extra help, juggling the responsibilities of parenthood and work. All that has already been done, and now we're ready, I hope, to take the next step. Today, in one of my committees, the Transportation Infrastructure Committee, we released the draft of our version of this bill, which tracks very closely with what President Biden has proposed. As many of you know, there's a lot of negotiation going on right now, and there are really two tracks. There's one through my committee where we are putting together a much more expansive bill, at least for the transportation sector, for rail and highways especially. And then there's a bipartisan negotiation, which I'm also involved with because I'm a member of this bipartisan problem solvers caucus in the House. We are hoping to be able to get a bipartisan deal, but we are ready to go either way. My bottom line is, I think most people I represent are not super passionate about Senate rules and procedures. They want us to deliver. They want us to pass legislation, get it to the president so that we can start helping people and helping our state as quickly as possible. And so I'm involved in both tracks of that effort, and one of them is going to reach its destination. I'm determined to make sure that that happens. This bill is going to fund the Gateway Tunnel. We now have most of the approvals that we need from the Biden administration. I've been writing them since the day Biden was sworn in. We still need to provide the funding for the first stages of the project, and one way or another, this bill is going to do that. My great hope is that in addition to making the incredibly important investments we need in our roads, in our railways, in our transit, in our water pipes, in our sewer system. By the way, I've spent the last few days talking to constituents in different parts of my district, including out in Frenchtown in Hunterdon County, where we got a grant for a local water and sewer system, about just the decades of unmet needs that we have to start investing in. This bill will do that. But on top of that, what I'm really pushing hard for is an investment that will help America lead the world in the transition from fossil fuels to clean energy as a means of powering our transportation system. And so we want in this bill to invest in electric cars, in charging stations, in the development of new technologies that will enable us to harness clean energy to power our cars and buses and trains and ultimately everything else in our economy. I see this as an incredibly important economic opportunity that the United States should seize before China, before our competitors do. So all of that is in various versions of this bill that are moving forward. And I'm hopeful that at some point this summer, we're going to have something that goes to Joe Biden. He's going to sign it, and we're going to spend the next few years at ribbon cuttings. At least elected officials like me are going to spend a lot of time at ribbon cuttings at projects in our communities that make our lives better and coincidentally put a lot of New Jerseyans to work doing good jobs that pay well and that also circulate more resources into our communities. So that's the good news. Now, you heard me say there are two tracks. There is the more partisan track and the more bipartisan track. And I'm still hopeful because I think it would be good for the country that we come together on something that may not be 100% of what Joe Biden asked for, but would still do the things that I just mentioned, would still be really good for us, and get it through the Senate with more than 60 votes, with a lot of Republicans in addition to the Democrats. At this point, I don't know if we're going to be able to do that. And we just went through a pretty dispiriting experience on another issue that's important to me, and that is our effort to try to establish a commission to investigate the assault on the Capitol, the insurrection that happened on January 6th. This was an example of true bipartisanship in drafting a piece of legislation. Democrats wrote a bill. It was a little bit weighted towards us. Republicans came to us and said, you know what, this is the right thing to do. We were all attacked. Our country was attacked. We need to get to the bottom of how such a thing could have happened so that we can make sure it never happens again. And we worked with those Republicans. We took all of their suggestions, literally every single request that came from the Republican side. And in the end, the stalwarts, the couple of dozen that were working with us, plus a few more in the House, did vote for the bill, but it only was 35. And the Republican leadership opposed it, even though we took everything that they asked for. And in the Senate, we weren't able to get 10 Republican votes. In fact, we won that vote 54-35, and yet because of the filibuster, it didn't pass. It didn't go to the president. And that's got a lot of us on my side scratching our heads and wondering, how can we do things in a bipartisan way, as much as many of us like me might want to, if we negotiate, if we compromise, if we do everything the other side asks for, but at the end of the day, they just cannot bring themselves to break with the loyalty, in this case, to the former president, and if they're just driven by a desire to say no to everything so that this president fails. And if that's going to be the dominant spirit on the other side, it's going to be very hard for those of us in the middle who are trying to find common ground to be successful. And it's going to have to affect the tactical choices we make about all of the legislation that we pursue from now on. Again, I'm always hopeful. I'm always willing to go the extra mile. We're going to do that on this infrastructure bill. But again, I come back to where I started. The responsibility we have is to deliver for you. And one way or another, we are going to make sure that we do that, at least on this infrastructure and jobs bill, and hopefully on a lot of other good legislation going forward. There's a lot else that's going on that I'm sure you'll ask me about. I just sent off a letter today that I led with one of my colleagues to the Biden administration, with dozens and dozens of our House members urging the president to move faster and to be bolder in helping to vaccinate the world against COVID. We're doing an amazing job in America. We've gone from last in the world to first in the world in fighting this horrible pandemic. But if you look at the map, it's just absolutely heartbreaking and dangerous how little vaccine has made its way to arms in other countries. And this is not just a humanitarian issue. This is about the health and safety of every American, because if this thing keeps raging in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, there will be new variants that arise that overpower our vaccines, and we're going to be right back where we started. So that's something that I'm working on that came out today. Lots of other issues, guns, SALT deduction, you name it. I look forward to hearing your questions and thoughts on all of those, and we'll spend as much time as we can trying to make sure that we answer all of them today. So thank you again. Nari, back over to you, and look forward to hearing what you all send my way today. Thanks.
Thanks, Tom. We are now going to begin with a few frequently asked questions that were submitted beforehand. And after that, we will go into live questioning. If your pre-submitted question was not answered or asked in the FAQ portion, please ask again using the chat feature for it to be answered live today. Just a reminder that if you are asking a question, please include your name and the town you are from, and I will add you to a list of questioners and unmute you before asking. All right, now is a great time to start submitting those questions, but let's start with some FAQs. Tom, you touched on this a little bit already in your opening remarks, but what is the status of Biden's infrastructure bill?
Well, we are trying to, the president right now is trying to see if he can find some common ground with the Senate Republicans, who are key to getting this over the finish line if we're going to do it in a bipartisan way. We can pass a bill in the House relatively easily. And there's debate about two big questions. Number one, the scope of the bill, what is included, and number two, how we're going to pay for it. So let's take those two in order. You may have heard when we talk about the scope of the bill that some of my colleagues on the Republican side have been saying it needs to be limited to, quote, traditional infrastructure, which they often define as just like roads and highways and bridges and tunnels. And President Biden, on the other hand, proposed a bill that defines infrastructure more broadly, I think appropriately, including water and broadband and the electrical grid, and a bunch of things like that. And on top of that, included some things that probably most people would not think of as infrastructure, but that many of us think are really important for the country, like trying to improve the system of home care for our disabled and elderly population. So where they seem to be coming down, and this is consistent with what my bipartisan group, the Problem Solvers Caucus, has recommended, is that some of the things that Biden proposed putting in his bill, some of the more kind of investment in people type provisions would drop out, at least for the infrastructure bill. We would take them up in other forms later. But it defines physical infrastructure fairly broadly, which only makes sense. Like, one thing I've been saying is that if you're gonna dig up a road to repave it, it would be pretty stupid not to fix the water pipes underneath, not to lay a broadband cable, only to then have to dig up the road 5 years or 10 years down the road to do those things. Like, why wouldn't we just do it all at once? Plus, we need all of those things, particularly the water infrastructure in our district is just a crying need. So all of that would be in a bipartisan bill. And I have said that it's got to include some of the clean energy related stuff, particularly electric cars, charging stations, the upgrades to the national electric grid that we're going to need as we're generating more power from wind and solar and other clean sources of energy and delivering it to our cars and to our homes. That's got to be in there. And it'd be hard for me to imagine a bipartisan bill passing without at least significant investments in those things. So that's the discussion about scope. Now, even tougher, as you can imagine, is the question of how we're going to pay for it all. And there is a big distinction here between where the president is and where some of the congressional Republicans are. They've been saying, ironically, either that we shouldn't pay for it, we should have a cheaper bill and use deficit spending to pay for it, or if we're going to pay for it at all, we should use user fees. We should raise user fees, which is code language in the transportation area for higher higher gasoline taxes and tolls, which is interesting because, you know, I don't like to get too political on these calls, but you all know there will be ads run against me, as there always are, about how I want to raise taxes on everybody. And in fact, it's Joe Biden who's trying to avoid raising taxes on anyone making under $400,000 a year. And my Republican colleagues in the Congress, at least, who are saying we should raise gas taxes to pay for infrastructure. On the other hand, Biden's proposal begins with trying to make corporations pay their fair share. And he started with a proposal to raise the corporate tax to 28% from the current level of 21. That would still be 7 percentage points lower than it was in 2017, where it was 35. Yesterday, he made a very interesting offer. He said, all right, we could keep it at 21%, but let's have at least a minimum corporate tax of 15%, so that, for example, companies like Amazon pay taxes. You all may know in 2018, Amazon paid 0. They paid an average effective rate of 4% over the last 10 years. Many other major corporations find perfectly legal ways to dodge paying taxes at all. And so the president's saying, and I totally agree with this, like, okay, we're going to keep these low corporate tax rates. At least they should pay those rates or something close to them. And so that we've thrown in now into this negotiation, and we'll see what happens. Personally, that's where I am. Look, I think, I do think we need to be responsible, try to pay for it. I'd much rather do it through making wealthy corporations pay their fair share, pay something, crack down on corporations sending all of their profits overseas, booking them to their subsidiaries and tax shelters so they avoid our tax system altogether. And also, and this, we pretty much agree with the Republicans, giving the IRS significantly more resources so that it can crack down on sophisticated tax evasion. We think we could raise between $300 billion and $1 trillion over 10 years just by doing that, and that wouldn't raise a single person's individual taxes. So that's kind of where the debate is. I think we're going to give this a couple of more weeks to see if we can get a bipartisan deal. If not, then with Joe Manchin's permission, we will move on to other means of passing this bill. Thanks.
Thanks, Tom. All right, we are going to do one more FAQ, and after that, we will start to begin live questioning. Again, just a reminder to use the chat feature at the bottom of your screen to submit your question to Tom. Tom, for your final FAQ, can you give us an update on the SALT deduction?
So we've talked a bit about the SALT deduction in these discussions about the infrastructure bill and additional legislation that Biden has proposed to invest in things like childcare and student loan relief and other things that he and I think are very, very important. And what I've said, and a number of my colleagues from states like New Jersey have said, is that if we're going to start talking about paying for these bills by changing taxes that real people pay, by raising, for example, the top individual tax rate back to 39.6 as it was in 2017, by messing with capital gains taxes, by messing with inheritance taxes and so forth. If we're going to do that, then we have to address the SALT deduction as part of the package. That's the point at which we would have the most leverage to insist on a change. It has always been really hard in the Senate because Mitch McConnell is just dead set against reopening the 2017 tax bill, which is the bill that took away our SALT deduction in the first place. But if we are moving something through to pay for these big investments that Biden is proposing, and those tax measures begin to touch on the individual taxes that you and I pay, that's when I'm going to be able to stand up, and my colleagues like Josh Gottheimer and Mikey Sherrill and others from New Jersey and New York, where we're going to be able to stand up and say, you can't do that, and you're not going to get our votes to do that unless we also address SALT. I don't think we're going to be able to pass through the Senate, as long as there's a filibuster, a standalone bill, just a single bill to address the SALT issue. But if it's part of a larger set of tax measures that affect our taxes in different ways, then we've got some leverage and a better chance. And there have been a lot of proposals put forward for how to do that, from full restoration of the SALT deduction to something more partial that's more targeted towards middle-class folks in states like ours that were hit particularly hard. So stay tuned. Know that I will throw my body in front of a train for this if I think that that's going to be effective. And it's just, it has to be timed well. It has to be an opportunity that we think we really can seize. And we're not there yet because we don't know where all these bills are going. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. All right, now we are going to start beginning live questioning. Again, if you have a question live for Tom, please use the chat feature at the bottom of your screen, and please include your name and the town you are from along with that question. First up, we have Caroline. Caroline from Lambertville. Caroline, can you hear us? One second, Caroline, do we have you?
You're muted, Caroline, still.
I'm trying to unmute Caroline. There we go.
Whoops.
One more time.
There we
Caroline,
go.
there we go.
Thank you. Hi, Tom. Thank you for being here again today and for all that you're doing for your district and far beyond that. My question is this. First of all, thank you, among other things, for supporting HR 1, of course. I'd like to find out more about it. In particular, what are the key provisions in HR 1, now I guess SB 1, that are absolutely vital to protect the integrity of voting in 2022 and beyond? And the second half of this question is, if we can't pass at least those key provisions, nor the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, what do you see as the path forward to preserving the integrity of our elections moving forward?
Yep. Good question, very timely. I'm worried about what's going on in states like Texas, states like Florida, Georgia, where we seem to have a single-minded effort to make it harder for people to vote after the record turnout in 2020. Including things like getting rid of drop boxes and Sunday voting in Texas, which blatantly directed at the African-American community, things that just don't make sense unless your intention is just to make it harder for people who you think might vote against you to vote in the first place. So HR 1 has a number of provisions that would just lock into place changes that were made in 2020 to make it easier for Americans to vote. Including early voting and mail voting and drop boxes. It would also address the problem of partisan gerrymandering, where one party, D or R, controls the process in a state and draws lines to protect their candidates and make it impossible for candidates from other parties to win. So it would be a hugely useful bill in pushing back against these efforts to suppress the vote in states across the country. It also has some really good provisions to fight corruption in our politics. My headline for this big, complicated bill is that it's a bill to make it easier for Americans to vote and harder for billionaires to buy our elections. Two things that I think the overwhelming majority of Americans, Democrats and Republicans would support. The other bill you mentioned, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, or H.R. 4, is also super important. It's in ways simpler. What it does is restore the effect and force of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, including provisions that enable some federal supervision of election law and rule changes in states that have a pattern and practice of voter suppression. This is a bill, including those federal supervision provisions, that used to pass in the US Senate unanimously. I think it got like 98 votes the last time it was up for renewal. And now, like everything, it's gotten more partisan. We've passed H.R. 1. It's now before the Senate. We have not passed H.R. 4 because we're doing hearings on it. We feel we got to establish more of an evidentiary record for future judicial review of the bill, that there is this problem right now. Shouldn't be hard to do, but it's taking a little time. We'll pass that, we'll send it to the Senate, and then you've got to deal with the filibuster, because I don't think either of these can get 60 votes in the current climate. Joe Manchin, Senator Manchin, who I mentioned before from West Virginia, wants us to go out of our way to try to get some Republican support, at least for H.R. 4, for the John Lewis bill. We're going to try to do that. We will make a good faith effort. And if that fails, then I think that sets up a real showdown between the filibuster and voting rights. And one or two Democratic senators are going to have to decide what's more important to them. We'll see what happens. I still hope that we can do at least H.R. 4, or maybe even some provisions of H.R. 1 passed on a standalone basis. You asked what happens if we can't. Well, we are challenging what we see as voter suppression in the courts. And ultimately, I think we're going to show people who are trying to suppress the vote that sometimes the best way to inspire people to vote is to try to tell them that they can't. And so I have, I'm concerned, but I'm still confident that the American people, including voters in the states that I'm most worried about, are not going to allow a bunch of cynical politicians to take away the most important right that we have as Americans. So we'll win this one way or another. Thanks, Caroline.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Caroline. Let's go to Bob from White House Station. Bob, can you hear us? Bob, do we have you? Bob S., you are unmuted. Go ahead with your question. All right.
Hello, can you hear me?
Oh, we can hear you now.
Yes. Hey, Bob.
Okay, I don't know what that was. I stand in line, I'm sure, Tom, to say thank you for all that you do for us and how well you do it. My question to you is really, what can be done to stop the widespread Medicare permitted profiteering on medical supplies and necessities? For example, when a wheelchair was needed, it was provided the following day by one of the approved suppliers. And the arrangement was, no, you're not getting an invoice for it. It goes to Medicare. And the amount is a rental. It's $100 a month for 13 months, and then it's yours. So that's $1,300. And I strongly suspect they also throw in a delivery charge expected. But this is the exact wheelchair you can go down to Walmart and purchase for $197. Or a hospital, a surgery, where Medicare pays $6,000 for a room that was never used. And when Medicare is contacted, the response is, oh, well, it was billed by the hospital. And so it was paid. And no matter what is said about, well, the room was never used, it goes back to the patient to contact the hospital, who, by the way, says, well, it was ordered by the doctor, so you need to go back to the doctor, who says you need to talk to the billing department. And in the meantime, Medicare has paid the $6,000. And I have found this to be true with all types of other medical supplies and necessities as well. I cannot fathom in my head trillions of dollars or billions of dollars or millions of dollars for a budget, nor can I fathom how many people are being billed through Medicare for this and what that is costing us.
Right.
How can this be looked into or resolved or come up with another method, such as you need a wheelchair, go down to Walmart, buy it for $200, submit the receipt to us, and we'll even give you an additional $25 for the transportation.
Yeah. Well, Bob, it sounds like the sort of thing a congressman should investigate. Your wheelchair example is really interesting, and I was taking notes. I'm sure my staff on the call is also taking notes. And sometimes big changes can come from small concrete examples. You know, we look into something like that and work backwards, like how does that happen? So I can't answer your most fundamental question, which is, how do we fix this? What is it in the system precisely that enables this to happen? It's obviously a huge government program. It's very complicated. A lot of the reforms that people are talking about right now, from allowing people to buy into Medicare to create more competition in the system, which is something I support, or Medicare for all, which some other people support, I don't think would address the problem that that you have put before us. And so here's what I'm going to do. I'll have my staff, if it's okay with you, be in touch with you directly to get more details, and we will follow up on that, because I'm really interested in answering this question more precisely. And having that kind of, the wheelchair example in particular is just it's a really vivid one. I'd like to get a little bit more about that. As everyone on this call knows, one of our big problems as a country is the overall cost of healthcare. We just lowered the price that a lot of Americans pay for health insurance in this American Rescue Plan that we built. That's great. It eases the burden on all of us, but it didn't change the total cost of healthcare in America. We pay like twice as much as a country for healthcare compared to most wealthy countries in the world that have good healthcare, just as good healthcare outcomes, if not better than America. And the difficulty in solving this is that if you're spending that much more and you want to spend less, that means a lot of people are going to be making less money, right? Because somebody's making money off of this healthcare system who shouldn't be. And it's always hard to make changes that result in powerful parts of our economy making less money. But oftentimes a vivid example like the one that you just offered can break through the noise and help propel that argument forward. So thank you so much.
And Bob, I just messaged you just requesting your email address. Just reach out to me with your email and I will send it along to our staff so we can get in touch with you as well.
Okay, thank you very much.
Great.
Thank
Thanks,
you, Bob.
Bob. Let's go to Neil in Hillsborough. Neil, can you hear us?
Yes, I can.
We can hear you. Go ahead with your question.
Okay. Congressman, thanks so much for holding these town halls. I'm finding them very, very interesting. I never in the past attended them, but you make them very worthwhile. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Actually, my question is a very easy one, although it's the solution that I think is very difficult. And that is, what is happening with the Postal Service?
Yeah. Yeah, that's not an easy one. Look, we had a lot of controversy about this last year, and we were worried in particular because of the important role that the Postal Service played last year, especially in making our election work. So many of us were voting by mail, and we didn't want delays in mail to affect the election. But also because we rely on the mail for so many other things. Many folks get their prescription drugs by mail. A huge part of our economy now is a delivery economy, and the post office does that last mile of delivery for a lot of private companies. So it's a very different post office from the days when we were sending postcards and letters to our friends and loved ones, but it is still an essential institution in America. And I believe needs to function on the same principle that it's functioned on since the dawn of the American Republic, and that is it serves everybody in America equally, whether you're living in downtown Manhattan or some little outpost in rural Maine or Alaska. You should be able to put the same kind of stamp on a letter and deliver, or package and have it delivered, or get a delivery from any other part of the country. That's got to be the principle. This is not, we don't want the post office to lose money, but it's not a for-profit business that would inevitably favor some customers over others based on the profit motive. So, we had a new guy who came in to run it with a very different, more kind of business corporate mindset under the Trump administration. He's still there, Louis DeJoy, because he's not appointed or fired by the president. He's appointed or fired by the Postal Board of Governors. We create that separation from the president in the law. And so, some of the changes that he's put into place, I think may take a little bit of time to unwind. He has made some good points, like we can't just keep running the Postal Service the way we used to because of all these changes in how we use the mail. But I do think that we need a Postmaster General who brings to the job the same fundamental ethos that Benjamin Franklin would have brought to the job, and that is that this is a public service and not a for-profit business. So I would expect to see some more changes as Biden is able to rotate out and in new members of the Postal Board of Governors. Thanks, Neil.
Thank you.
Thanks, Neil. Next up, we have Brian from Raritan. Brian, can you hear us?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
So maybe not such a super serious question, but one of great interest nevertheless, with a serious aspect to it. I would be curious to know a little bit of the backstory about how the mandate for a government report on unidentified aerial phenomena got into the COVID stimulus bill. But I also just want to say that, as Carl Sagan said, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. So, we shouldn't assume that what we see flying around necessarily comes from an otherworldly source, but we should also ask ourselves why we stigmatize the observation and the reporting of these events. Our military pilots admit that they're uncomfortable talking about the subject, even though they see them. Our commercial pilots feel the same way, and no respectable scientist really wants to touch it with a 10-foot pole. So I'd be curious, your thoughts on the topic and how we might destigmatize it, especially since the more likely explanation is that these are artificial objects created by global adversaries, and they're putting us at risk in terms of our national security. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
Thank you. So this is actually the first question I've gotten on UFOs in the, I don't know, almost 100 town halls I've done. I've lost count, but I'm glad you asked, because I've been fascinated by it for some years. My background is in national security and foreign policy, so I've been hearing these stories coming from our pilots for some time. I'm also a huge science fiction fan, so I'm interested. And you mentioned Carl Sagan. I remember watching his PBS show when I was a kid, and I remember he did this pretty straightforward mathematical calculation to try to figure out the likelihood of intelligent life existing on another planet at the same time as we have intelligent life on Earth. And based on what was known about the universe at the time, his calculation determined that it was extremely unlikely, based on like how many Earth-like planets there are rotating around similar stars in the galaxy, and all kinds of other factors. And what's really interesting is that based on what we now know about the universe, the developments in astronomy and astrophysics since then, Carl Sagan's formula is totally out the door. And or maybe to put it another way, if you apply the same formula, the same reasoning that he applied, you get the opposite answer, namely that it's actually extremely likely that we're not alone in the universe. And I'm very, I find that really fascinating and interesting. And I believe in trying to know as much as we can about the nature and the meaning of the universe. So I'm a huge supporter of NASA. I absolutely would want to destigmatize this question. I don't think it's different from any other scientific question that we ask ourselves every single day as a human species. Now, what's happening with our pilots and these sightings? Some of it does seem kind of weird, and honestly, I don't think anyone has a definitive explanation for at least some of the stranger sightings. But there is this alternative, perhaps more earthly explanation that you suggested, that has been put forward by some experts, that what we're seeing are, in effect, drones, unmanned vehicles that our adversaries have put in the air to kind of deliberately be seen by our pilots, so that the pilots then trigger their sophisticated sensors and evasion systems, and then the adversary observes what we're doing and the technology that we have and learns more about it. That's entirely possible, but we don't know if that's true either. Either way, whether we're being visited by friends or maybe adversaries from far beyond this galaxy or solar system, or we're being messed with by the Chinese or the Russians in ways that could threaten our national security, we want to know. And that's why this provision was put in the bill, because we shouldn't be afraid of asking these kinds of questions, and we should approach them in a rational, reasoned way, and in a way that's very transparent with the American people. Whatever we find out, people should know. Thanks for raising that. That was fun.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks, Tom. Next up, we have Vince in Skillman. Vince, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hey, Vince.
Hi, good afternoon, Congressman. I really appreciate this time. I think as a veteran and also as a former congressional intern, I was appalled on January 6th, and it's still affecting me today. I'm really hoping there'd be bipartisan support in the Senate to get that bill through and get the investigation going. But with that, with the Democrats having the majority, do you see the party taking on specific action to actually investigate what happened on January 6th and hold those accountable, responsible for what happened?
Yes. So look, I think it would have been vastly better to have a professional, nonpartisan commission look at this, given how divided we are as a country. A commission just like the 9/11 Commission, and that's what we put forward. That's what 35 Republicans joined us in supporting on the House floor, but ultimately got shot down by a vote of 54-35 in favor. It's weird. We're the only country that does this. But anyway, it's not going to happen because of the Republican filibuster in the Senate. So in light of that, although it is not the best way forward, I think we are going to, and I would support creating a select committee in the House to try to do the same thing. And of course, that would be a committee with Republicans and Democrats on it. It would have subpoena power. It would still be, I think, very, very useful. Simultaneously, the Justice Department is doing its job. The FBI is doing its job. So people who committed crimes that day, allegedly committed crimes, are going to be investigated. And if it is deemed proper by our independent Justice Department, they will be prosecuted and they will be punished. So that in and of itself has had a real impact on the ability of groups like the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers and all of these assorted far right wing, crazy conspiracy mongering militias. It's had an effect on their ability to organize. And that's a positive that has come out of that tragedy. But we need to do more than just bring people to justice. We've got to understand better as a country how that happened. How could people holding Confederate flags have breached the Capitol, something that didn't happen even in the Civil War? How could you have such a mass assault on law enforcement in the heart of Washington? How could so many of those people who, in every other way appeared to be normal Americans, how could all of them have been deluded into thinking that a violent assault on the Capitol of the United States was a normal thing to do, a legitimate thing to do? How do we make sure it doesn't happen again in any form? Those are questions that are not for prosecutors to answer and for judges and juries to answer. That's something that we need to answer so that we know what we need to do. Thanks.
Thanks, Vince, and thanks, Tom. Let's go to Victoria. Victoria from Hampton. Victoria, can you hear us? Victoria, do we have you? Last call.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes, hi.
Hi, Tom Malinowski. I'll get right to the point. Last week, we asked you to co-sponsor the Civilian Climate Corps for Jobs and Justice Act, which would create 1.5 million good jobs in sustainable fields. This legislation is completely different from American Jobs Plan, which you cited last week as your excuse for not supporting this legislation. We need millions of good jobs, specifically in green fields, where people will be put to work building sustainable infrastructure, transitioning our energy sources to clean energy generation, and investing in communities to make them more resilient against the climate crisis. We need this legislation in addition to the American Jobs Plan, which is a great start, but is not enough in the long run. Will you co-sponsor the Civilian Climate Corps for Jobs and Justice Act and commit to doing your part to protect our people and the planet?
Thanks, Victoria. So I support a Civilian Climate Corps. This is based on one of the great Depression era New Deal programs, the Civilian Conservation Corps. And the idea of a Civilian Climate Corps is to put folks, particularly young people, to work on projects around the country to improve our resiliency against climate change, to build natural infrastructure, to build projects that help us at a community level, at a local level, make that all-important transition from fossil fuels to clean energy. Joe Biden did propose a version of this, which maybe is not as ambitious as what you support or what's in the bill that you cite. But that's one reason I support the American Jobs Plan, because it has this very good idea in it. I'm not prepared to co-sponsor the larger piece of legislation yet. I've started to study it. I'll be very honest with you. I found some things in it I don't agree with. Restrictions on, for example, on using this program to support any project that advances carbon capture or carbon taxation or market-based policies to advance our climate goals. If that's really where that's going, I find it a little bit too ideologically rigid to me. I think we need a multiplicity of approaches if we are going to meet this immense challenge of averting catastrophic climate change. And some of those approaches are going to be market-based. Some of those approaches are going to mean working with the private sector. It's not all going to be just wind and solar. It will include nuclear power, in my opinion. So we may have some substantive disagreements about elements of that bill. But if your primary goal is supporting creating a civilian climate corps, that's something I do agree with. Thanks.
Thanks, Tom, and thanks, Victoria. Next up, we have you from Somerset. Do we have you?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you for taking my question. So I've heard Representative Tom Malinowski, talking about our material conditions. Like we just went through a COVID pandemic, and we need a lot of investment here in the U.S. and also, in our state of New Jersey. However, I have been greatly displeased to find out that 2 days ago, there was a letter sent to Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, in which a bipartisan group of lawmakers signaled approval to Israel's request for $1 billion in emergency funding. And I did the math on this, and that works out to $2.7 million a day. I want you to explain why you would co-sign onto such a letter, especially considering we just saw, 10 days of fighting, and we've seen, the outcome. It was, 266 Palestinians were killed. 256 were killed, of which 66 were children. And we all looked on in horror as a high-rise building that housed the Al Jazeera and Associated Press were leveled to the ground. Thank you.
Sure. Look, I share your horror over the violence that broke out among Israelis and Palestinians, and then ultimately between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. This is something that it would take us a long time to really do justice to this question, but I will try to address the part that you raised with me. This latest outbreak of violence as in the form of a protest movement by Palestinians in East Jerusalem who were peacefully protesting what they felt, I think with some reason, was an unjustified seizure of land by government authorities in Israel from Palestinians, from Israeli Arabs. And it was a peaceful movement, robust, raucous, but peaceful. And as often happens when Palestinians try to assert their rights peacefully, Hamas, which is a terrorist group, a fascist group, in my opinion, a group that exercises power through murder and torture of its own people, hijacked that movement by launching thousands, over 4,000 ultimately, rockets at populated areas in Israel, rockets which are impossible to target, which are fired deliberately to murder innocent civilians. And then Israel decided, as it always does in those situations, that rather than simply absorbing that fire, they strike back, and they hit back at Gaza, which is a densely populated area where Hamas fires rockets from within densely populated civilian communities. And the result was terrible destruction, including, as you said, the death of some 66 children and the downing of several office towers in ways that I think were very, very troubling. So that's kind of my short summary of that very complicated exchange in this latest outbreak of violence between Israelis and Palestinians. The death toll on the Israeli side within Israel, and this is the key point in answering your question, would have been in the hundreds, possibly the thousands, from those rockets, if not for the United States having provided Israel with the Iron Dome missile defense system, which shot down most of those rockets before they could hurt anybody. And so what Israel was asking for here was an emergency replenishment of aid, primarily to ensure that that missile defense system continues to be strong and up and running in case this sort of thing ever happens again. That Iron Dome missile defense system saved Israeli lives. It saved Israeli Arab lives. Some of the casualties, by the way, from those Hamas rockets were Israeli Arabs. They don't distinguish based on who you are. And it saved lives of Palestinians in Gaza, because if not for Iron Dome, Israel would almost certainly fire back with even greater ferocity. So I did sign that letter. I stand by that. I also signed a letter urging our colleagues in the Senate to lift a hold that they have placed on humanitarian aid to Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank. I strongly support the Biden administration's decisions to restart diplomatic contacts with and humanitarian assistance to the Palestinian people. And I've made public statements that stress the importance, in the absence of a two-state solution to solve this problem once and for all, calling for a greater emphasis in American diplomacy on protecting the human rights and dignity of everybody on both sides of this conflict, including Palestinians inside Israel and the West Bank. Thanks so much.
Thanks both. And just a reminder, if you have a question for Tom, please first ask your question using that chat feature at the bottom of your screen. We're going to do our best to get through as many questions as we have that are being asked today. We are heading to Hillsborough. Joan, can you hear us? Joan, do we have you?
Yes, you have me.
Great. Go ahead with your question.
Hello? Okay.
Sure.
Hi, Congressman. I've met you. We've discussed my question before. I support Medicaid for all. Medicare for all would be a second choice for me. I am really hearing lots of stories about people who cannot afford their drugs. They're middle-class working people.
Yeah.
Now, the thing for me is, why does the middle class have to go bankrupt to get good health care? Why is it that somebody who is wealthy doesn't have to worry about that, and somebody who is poor doesn't have to worry about that? They get Medicaid or a state program. Why can't we have Medicaid for every person in this country, including our elderly? I have an elderly mother with Alzheimer's, 96 years old, who is now going to go on Medicaid. that to me is something she would be ashamed of. Luckily, she doesn't know. But I'm just tired of not getting a good, solid program. With Medicaid, it's an easier program for people to manage. We don't have to worry about drugs. They're included, eyes, all of that.
Yep.
Right now, Medicare, which I am on, is a difficult program for most people to manage. I love it, by the way. I am very grateful I have Medicare, but I worry about all of the people that don't have that kind of coverage. So what is being done?
Thank you. Number one, really well said. I think you hit the nail on the head in describing the problem. It was particularly people who were in the middle who got caught with not being able to afford basic health care, which is a human right or should be treated like a human right in our country. What is being done and what should be done? I'll start with what's being done. I alluded to this earlier on, but in the bill we passed earlier this year, the American Rescue Plan, we put in a provision that says if you make too much for Medicaid and for the generous subsidies that lower income people get under the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare, but you're also not getting really good health insurance from your employer. If you're one of those people caught in the middle who had to go out and try to find expensive health insurance on the individual marketplace, we are going to now provide much more generous subsidies. We have said that nobody can be expected to pay more than around 8% of their income for health insurance on the individual marketplace. And when you do the math and you look at, kind of a typical couple living in New Jersey, 55, 60 years old, they're not yet of Medicare age, they're making $60,000, $70,000 a year, they're saving, in some cases, over $1,000 a month on their health insurance under this bill. Others maybe a little bit less, maybe a couple of $100s a month, but boy, does that add up. So that's something we've already done. Now, what more can we do? I very strongly believe that every American should have the freedom to buy into a public option. Now, that could be something that looks like Medicare, could be something that looks like Medicaid. That's something we would have to work out, but we should agree on that principle that everyone should have the freedom, at whatever age they are, to be able to buy into that through their employer health plan on the individual marketplace, whatever, while keeping this rule that no one should pay more than a certain amount of their income for whatever coverage they're getting. And then finally, I'm for something that you've probably seen some TV ads about in our district in the last few weeks. I'm for allowing Medicare to negotiate with pharmaceutical companies for the price of prescription drugs. It's really amazing to me that every other company that contracts with the government, they're subject to negotiation because we're a capitalist country, we're a market economy. The only companies that are protected, that get to name their price and the government has to take their price, is our pharmaceutical industry. And I love our pharmaceutical companies. They're all around our district and they employ a lot of us. They do amazing work, but I don't think that they should get a better deal than the rest of corporate America. I think Medicare should be allowed to negotiate. And it's a huge debate. And so lots of money has been spent advertising to you guys in the last few weeks on both sides of that question. But I think it's a pretty straightforward issue to me. So that's my answer. Really good question. Before we take another question, I need to let folks know that we seem to have like a huge storm coming into where I am right now. So if you lose me, it's because we lost power. It's not because I don't want to take any more questions, but we'll keep going for a little while longer.
Thanks for the update, Tom. Next up, we have Howard from Bridgewater. Howard, can you hear us?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, hi, Howard.
Tom, the same weather system you have just started here, so hopefully we can all stay on.
Good.
First of all, as others have said, thank you very much for everything you do for us.
Thank you, Howard.
We are very fortunate to have you as our representative. On the infrastructure and jobs bill, I was doing a little digging into what the Republicans mean by user fees. And in addition to the gas tax and tolls, apparently they want to include as user fees a fee on electric vehicle use in lieu of a gas tax, because purely electric vehicles, of course, don't use gas. But they want to put a fee on electric vehicles, which is mind-boggling to me, because it discourages the use of clean energy, and we should be doing everything we can to support electric vehicles. So I was just wondering what your reaction was on that.
Sure. So look, there is a fair point that they have, and it's not just the Republicans who are making it, and that is, you know, we do have a system where we use gas taxes to fund highway repairs in America. There's a highway trust fund, and it was set up basically to be replenished through gas taxes. Gas taxes have not been raised federally since 1993, which means in real terms, the gas tax is about 40% less today than it was in 1993. So number one, a lot of thoughtful people have argued that, yeah, we should actually raise the gas tax a little bit, index it to inflation so we don't have this debate all the time. And then what are we going to do about electric cars? I want to see way more electric cars on our highways. We have major auto manufacturers that have said they're going to phase out gas using vehicles altogether in the next 10 years. So we could have a situation before long in this country where it's pretty much all electric vehicles on the highways. And so we are going to need to have some way of making those vehicles pay for the highways that they use, because every vehicle contributes to wear and tear on our roads, right? So I think it's not totally unreasonable, and what we've talked about is something like a vehicle miles traveled tax that would be weighted in a way that takes into account the energy efficiency of the vehicle. So there would still be some benefit even there to having an electric vehicle over something that uses more uses energy less efficiently. So, my answer is, yeah, we do kind of have to move in that direction. But at the same time, I want really generous tax incentives to encourage people to buy that first electric car at this moment of transition, at this moment when it's still kind of new and special and a little more expensive to get that EV. We do need tax incentives. And I think if we continued and expanded the generous tax incentives that we have right now, while moving to a road use tax that better reflects the kinds of vehicles that are on the highway, that would be a good balance. Does that make sense?
Just unmuted you, Howard.
Okay.
It makes a certain amount of sense. To me, it would make more sense for the general tax, for the income tax or the general gas tax, I guess probably the income tax, to pay money into the trust fund in lieu of a taxation on electric vehicles.
Right.
Then it really depends. Then it's really a question of which pocket is paying into which pocket, rather than having to pay extra at the pump every time, but then getting it back at the end of the year or in withholding. It just seems to me like a more direct way of subsidizing electric vehicles might be a good idea, but I understand it gets complicated.
Yeah. It all makes sense.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thanks, Howard. Thanks, Tom. Next up, we have Tyler from Reddington. Tyler, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Thank you, Congressman. The oceans, the health of our oceans is a very broad topic. But there's a sentence from a group called Ocean Conservancy. Their website says, "Our ocean unifies our world like nothing else, and saving it from ongoing threats is a cause that affects us all." We lost, there are things like plastic pollution. There's various environmental disasters that happened. One happened off of Sri Lanka recently. There's a toxic waste going into the ocean off of Florida. There's plastic pollution. I think there's the threat, there's climate change, and with the climate change comes increased hurricanes, and then the corals are dying.
Right.
We're losing our apex predators. We're losing the small fish that they feed on. So it's a broad-based question. I guess my concern is we lost ground under the prior administration. And what are you trying to do to ensure that climate change stays beyond 4 years? And as a congressman from New Jersey, what you're doing to take care of the ocean, take care of our oceans.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it is a broad question, but I'll touch on a few elements of it. We lost ground. We've been losing ground for more than just the last administration, as you know. I just read yesterday, folks in Miami are looking at proposals to build a 20-foot high wall between the city and the ocean. And they hate it because it'll be ugly. It'll ruin the character of their community. But there's another American city, another American community that is coming to terms with the reality of climate change and the things it's going to force us to do. And if we lose more ground, we're going to be doing much more painful things than building 20-foot high walls around our coastal cities. So there should be a sense of urgency. This should not be a partisan issue. This should be just a practical problem that we all come together to deal with. The infrastructure and jobs bill we've been talking about is actually a good start if we do some of the things that Biden has asked us rightly to do in transitioning our transportation sector away from fossil fuel-based vehicles, in vastly expanding our electrical grid in this country so that we can actually deliver the electricity that's generated by clean power, investing more in natural infrastructure across the country, so many other good things in that bill. He's proposed setting a binding target for lowering emissions and ultimately eliminating or going to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by the year 2050. We've done that in the state of New Jersey. A bunch of other states have done that. We need a national standard. And I'll tell you, our utility companies, our energy companies want this. They want to know what the destination is. They want to have certainty in the marketplace so that they can start making the investments they need to make to transition into being very different kinds of energy companies, different kinds of utilities. So those are some of the things that I'm championing. I believe very strongly that part of the mix should be a market price or tax on carbon that then generates revenue that's shared back with the American people, a carbon cashback, if you will, to create this massive market incentive for everybody to accelerate our transition. And in the meantime, yeah, we need to limit our use of plastics. I'm inspired by the kids I meet in schools across the district, and one of the first things they ask me about is plastic straws, because the younger generation is learning this stuff. Just as we taught our parents to use seatbelts, they're teaching us that we need to change the products that we use to try to limit ocean pollution and the horrible destruction that we've seen to coral reefs around the world. I want to be preserving more marine territory, if you will, in the way that we preserve our national parks. That's something that we were trying to do under the Obama administration to some effect in waters that the United States controls. And I hope that the new administration will go in that direction too. Thank you so much.
Thank you both. Let's go to Susan from Alexandria. Susan, can you hear us?
Yes, I can.
Go ahead with your question.
I'm really concerned about this increasing rash of cyber attacks, ransomware cyber attacks, criminal organizations that are kind of welcome in Russia, and how cryptocurrencies kind of play into the only choice that companies like Colonial Pipeline and hospitals have is to pay the ransom. Do you have any insight into what the Biden administration is going to do to address this? It's only going to get worse, and it could. I'm worried about our electric grid, for instance.
Yes, it's a totally legitimate question. These attacks are already doing tremendous harm, as we saw with the pipeline and other things in recent days. And here's the most important thing you need to know about these hacking gangs that are operating out of Russia and other countries in the former Soviet Union aligned with Russia. And that is that they all have a policy of never attacking targets in Russia. And why do they have that policy? Because if they attack targets in Russia, then Russian law enforcement would go after them. And Putin's not going after them if all they do is attack Americans. That's all you need to know right there. Whether the Russian government is orchestrating this or not, in that respect, they are responsible because they are protecting these ransomware people just in the way that some countries have been justly accused in the past of protecting terrorist organizations. And so I think we need to strike back pretty hard. We do have offensive cyber tools that the government doesn't talk about in great detail, but just as our adversaries have the ability to harm us with cyber tools, we have the ability to harm them. During the Cold War, one of the things that kept us safe was deterrence, was the certainty that if a nuclear power launched a nuke at us, we would be able to do the same to them, and that kept the peace. Nobody attacked anybody. And we are now kind of rapidly trying to figure out how to establish some rules that protect law-abiding countries from these kinds of cyber attacks, and that enable the United States and our allies in NATO to be able to strike back in appropriate ways when these things happen to us. I think that's the only way to restore cyber peace, if you will. And we also have to harden our systems, and companies that control these critical systems, like Colonial, need to do a better job working with the government, protecting themselves against attacks, being transparent when they're forced to pay a ransom. So that all has to happen as well. But I'm focused in my thinking on the fact that these attacks are coming from gangs operating out of a particular country, and that just can't be acceptable. Thanks.
Thanks, Susan. Thanks, Tom. Let's go to James in Flemington. James, can you hear us?
Yeah.
Go ahead with your question.
I was just so it's great that we're giving citizens thousands of dollars through the past stimulus and stuff, but I'm wondering how the U.S. is going to pay off the $28 trillion or something in debt, especially with Biden releasing a $6 trillion budget. So, I mean, it's all fun and games until you realize all spending eventually comes back to the average American.
Yeah, thank you. And it's a totally fair question. I want to make a distinction in my answer between what we did to rescue the country and the economy from the COVID crisis and what we're doing to invest in the future. The rescue, I think almost every economist would say, when the economy is going through that kind of free fall, you've got to spend money to stop the free fall. That's when you use borrowed money. And if we hadn't done it, we'd be heading towards a Great Depression in America right now, rather than the booming recovery that is, I think, underway. And that Great Depression not only would have resulted in tremendous suffering among the American people, also would have made it impossible to ever pay down our national debt. So I think that was the right call. We are now looking at a different type of spending. We're investing in infrastructure. We want to be investing in people. And I think at the very least, and this is not going to be a full answer to your concern, but at the very least, we need to pay for the investments that we're making, which is why I am willing to look at an increase in the corporate tax, why I am in favor of significantly increased tax enforcement and better service from the IRS. It's why I really want to crack down on foreign tax havens. It's why I would be willing to raise that top individual tax rate back to what it was in 2017, and why, despite some of my criticism of my Republican colleagues for only considering gas taxes, yeah, I do think that the fact that the gas tax hasn't been raised in 1993 is something that we ought to be looking at. So huge investments that are going to bring tremendous reward to Americans, that will stimulate our economy, create jobs. But we should be willing to pay for these investments in those kinds of ways or other ways that others may propose. Now, is that going to pay down the debt by itself? No. To do that, we need a sustained economic recovery, which will produce better tax revenues. That's how ultimately a combination of modest tax adjustments and economic recovery, how we eliminated the deficit under President Clinton, as you remember. At the same time, we have to do something that we alluded to earlier in this call that's really, really hard, and that's to bring healthcare costs in America under control, because that's where you get the huge amount that we spend on Medicare and Medicaid and associated things. If we can't get that under control, then I don't see a viable way of paying down the debt. So that would be my quick answer to your very important and not simple question.
Thanks, James, and thanks, Tom.
Thank you.
This is going to be our last question for today, and it is coming from Kim from Lebanon. Kim, can you hear us?
I can. Hi.
Hi, go ahead with your question.
I came on the call a little bit late, so I wanted to just ask a quick question. My company told me about the American Rescue Plan, and they said that, you can extend your COBRA. I didn't know it was called a subsidy if you don't have insurance or marketplace, et cetera. Do you have to pay back this subsidy until September of September 30th?
No.
Because I think of subsidy and I think of like tax, and I think of the stuff that's on the tax form and having to pay back everything.
No, this is not a loan. This is not something you have to pay back. There's just a lot of good stuff in that bill to help lower the cost of healthcare. And I didn't mention COBRA before, but that's included as well. What I mentioned before was folks shopping for their own coverage on the individual marketplace. I don't know your situation, Kim, but you might want to at least look into that. So anyone who's interested, just go on getcoverednewjersey.com, which is our state exchange website. And you can enter your information into that and see what it gives you. And it might be something better than what you have. But if you're on COBRA and that's the best option for you right now, that should also be significantly less expensive.
Yeah, and they were saying under the American Rescue Plan that you don't have to pay a premium for that. So I just wanted to be kind of square with that and make sure I'm not going to get billed later on for premiums. Because
you're not going to have to. It's not like a loan where it's just, yeah. So, and if I'm mistaken about any of this, because I don't want to mislead you either, I can also have my staff reach out to you and just go over your specific individual situation just to make sure that we're giving you absolutely accurate information that's tailored to where you are.
Thank you. A little bit broader, before you leave me. Is there going to be a penalty? I know Joe Biden is in office. You know, there's some great things happening, of course. Are we going to get a penalty for not having insurance, health insurance? Because that happened under Obama.
Right. So that's part of the legal case that's going to the Supreme Court around the Affordable Care Act. Right now, there is no penalty because that was eliminated by the Congress, I think in 2017 as part of the tax bill. And so there's a debate now in front of the Supreme Court. If you don't have the penalty, can you somehow separate that from the rest of the Affordable Care Act? Might the whole Affordable Care Act get struck down, which a lot of people have been worried about too? My guess is that's not going to happen. My guess is we're going to be able to keep some version of the Affordable Care Act without the penalty for those who don't have insurance. I would still hope that you remain covered at all times for your sake and everybody's sake. And my focus right now is on trying to make sure, whatever your situation in life, that coverage is as affordable as possible for good health insurance, not for substandard health insurance, but for good insurance that covers everything that you might need. So we can get back to you on the COBRA question just to make sure that you're getting everything that you need. But again, I would encourage everyone who's not in the Medicare group, and if you're not satisfied with the health insurance you have, look at what Get Covered New Jersey might have to offer for you. It's certainly a lot better than it would have been a few months ago.
That sounds promising. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it, sir.
Okay.
Thanks, Kim. And again, I dropped that link to Get Covered NJ in the chat feature. It's nj.gov/getcoverednj. I'll drop that one more time. And again, this is a great resource for everyone to check to see what's available for enrollment. One other thing, if you didn't get your question answered today, we do apologize, but we do ask that you contact us via our online form at malinowski.house.gov/contact. I just put that in the chat feature as well. A staff member will get back to you after reviewing your message. All right, thank you guys so much. I'll turn it over to Tom for some closing remarks.
Thank you, Nari. Thanks everybody for the great questions as always. We covered a lot of territory here, not everything, but a good amount for an hour and a half. I'll keep on doing these events, so keep logging on. I hope at some point in the summer, I'll get a chance to start doing them live and in person again, since I hope everybody on this call is vaccinated, and that most people in our communities are as well. And maybe we'll do a mix going forward, because there are some people who may find this easier, and others who much prefer to just gather at the community center and have a chance to grill me face to face. So we'll keep doing this. It's super fun and interesting for me. I always learn something, as I think you saw me taking notes for a couple of questioners today. And most important, this is what defines my priorities. We don't all agree on everything, and that's impossible. But what the most important thing I learn on these calls is what's important to you, the issues that you need me to be working on, the problems you need me to be trying to solve, and that's what keeps me going. So thank you again, and stay safe. Hope the weather improves, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.